Muted.
We're going to want another couple of minutes to get on board, and then we'll get started. And if he is having any technical issues, you can email Kristen. And Kristen Kunkel has been helping to put all this together. She's an environmental education specialist with NAAE. Just email her or Regina, and we'll help you get on board with the technology issues if you have any. Web can be a little tricky at times. Hopefully you can see the screen that says NAAE. Move it forward just to make sure everybody can see it. It's in public participation, and you should see a photo. And if you type something in the chat, you should see a photo of two people on a rock ledge about to let her go. So she goes crashing to the ground. Just kidding. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I hope that everybody can hear okay. My name is Judy Browse, and I'm the Executive Director of NAAE, and really thrilled that you are here to hear Marc Stern. I'll tell you more about Marc in a minute. But this is part of a new monthly webinar series that NAAE is sponsoring as part of eePRO. We'll talk more about that in the website, but we're trying to do these webinars the fourth Tuesday of every month. Some months that won't work for various reasons, so you just need to check the schedule. And that we'll be doing sessions on issues that people have told us they want to hear more about, they want to know more about, and we're really trying to bring new ideas, new speakers, new thinking to the field of environmental education, and hopefully improve our practice and the quality of our work in the field. So the next webinar, and we'll tell you more about this at the end as well, is David Orr, who's going to be talking about systems thinking and sustainability in education. Really exciting. If you haven't ever heard David, he's fantastic. What we'd like to do today, as soon as I can click slide here, whoops, let me go back here, is a little quickie on how to use WebEx, because Marc is going to want to have you typing some information into the chat. And a little about the webinar series we'll have at the end after Marc's presentation, and then questions and discussion. So we want to hear from Marc, and we want to be able to have time for some questions and discussion. Simply on WebEx, if there's any of you that are new to WebEx, it's easy to type into chat room, and the chat is easier than the question and answers for us to see. So you can see some messages to everyone in there already. I sent a note that says, hi, everyone, and Kristen sent a note. You can type anything in there and send it to all participants, and everyone will see what you send in. So when you have a question, you can just put into the question, into the chat room, and hit send. So everybody can see that. It's very easy. If you have any trouble, just send us an email, and we'll help you. Okay? So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marc Stern, who's a professor at Virginia Tech. And Marc has so many areas of interest, from looking at the human dimensions on natural resource policy to how we can all do a better job of evaluating our environmental education programs. He's also very interested in issues surrounding attitudes and action in the field and how trust plays a role in public participation. What the webinar is all about today. I met Marc when he was part of the evaluation team for Together Green, which was a $20 million initiative between Audubon and Toyota to promote leadership, conservation, and education with a focus on increasing diversity and inclusion in the environmental movement. And Marc was part of the evaluation team that helped evaluate that, looking at a 5-year program and how we could learn lessons from the work that we were doing. It was fantastic. Marc's research spanned many areas of interest and geographies, including studies on conflict around protected areas in the United States, the Caribbean, South America, and Asia. and also looking at the U.S. Forest Service planning processes, public involvement in collaborative efforts and interpretive programs across the U.S. National Park Service, and a bunch of educational and conservation initiatives around the world. He published over 50 peer-reviewed academic journal articles, along with dozens of book chapters, technical reports, and publications. And he's currently working on a book which is scheduled to be published by Oxford University Press next year, and intended to serve as a guide for all of us working in environmental education to use social science theory in our everyday jobs. So you know, too, those of you who do know Marc, that he's also an explorer. And this one, we were meeting at Disney for a Children in Nature Network meeting, and we had just gone on a little safari thing in Africa. So there's Marc having fun at Disney. So let's welcome Marc, and I'm going to turn this over to him, and we'll get this going. And I'm happy all of you could join.
Thank you, Dee, and thanks for inviting me. And thank you all for joining us. The formatting's a little weird on the PowerPoints. We had some sort of glitch when we were combining our PowerPoints, so the animations that I had planned won't work, but we should fine anyway. You'll see I put a little green box here that's asking you to actually do something. To get into the chat area, and briefest terms possible, to me just some idea of the types of public participation you're engaged in or would like to be engaged in, or this context in which you're thinking about the trust and public participation. It'll help me to kind of orient the talk. So as you're doing that, I'll give you the overview of what we're going to talk about today. Generally, I'm going to start and not spend much time on this, but really briefly talk about why we do public participation and what I mean by it, so that I'll be on the same page with that. Then we're going to jump pretty quickly into what tends to drive outcomes when we're dealing with the public and various stakeholder groups. I'll share lessons from research that illustrate some of these points, and I'll give some key lessons that we should all be considering as we go out and do public participation. I'm going to stay kind of at a high level because my guess is that there's a whole bunch of folks that are doing a whole bunch of really different things. So I'll have a few examples, but a lot of this is going to be pretty general kind of principles that can apply across the board. So great. I'm seeing some responses in the chat room. Thank you very much. All right, engagement with the Ketterick Foundation. Spark Public Participation. Great. Early childhood environmental educators. Cool. Collective action for conservation. Excellent. Okay, we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff. And as other ideas come up, I'm going to keep my eye on that. So if you have questions, put them there. I'll have that open as I'm talking and stop. Hopefully I'll see them, and I'll stop and try and ask them.
This is Judy. If we see some, we'll interrupt you a little bit if you miss something.
Great. Thanks. So just to start, my guess, since all of you are on this call to begin with, you have a good reason for doing public participation. But to frame the way that I think about it so we can all be on the same page, I like to just think about the characteristics of the environmental challenges we're all facing, right? We know that they're ever-changing, and that means that any solution that we might think works today is probably going to be the solution that's going to work tomorrow or in 10 years. So we know that we need to be nimble and innovative. We also know that the problems we're addressing are really complex, and not only that, they're wicked. And I think everyone on this call has heard that term, but there's a specific definition to wicked, and what that means is not only is it a hard problem to address technically to solve, but there's a disagreement about what the problem actually is and what the solution even looks like. So when you hear scientists and throwers use that term, that's what they mean. And the lesson for us is that science can't really help us there sometimes. Science can narrow our degree of uncertainty about a problem through doing research. It can help us predict if we do X, then Y might happen, but it can't really resolve what we think should happen, right? It is all value conflicts. So we're kind of stuck in this place where we've got to have all that out ourselves, and science can't do that for us. We also know that because things are ever-changing, and because these are really value-based problems, we really need relationships and collaboration to allow us to work together, to innovate, to draw on multiple talents of all kinds of folks with different values, different sectors, different disciplines. So that we do this, right? We can incorporate multiple viewpoints and talents of different people. All collaboration and public participation can help us move past stalemates, litigation, other arrangements at which people can end up shouting at each other instead of working together. It can help us build constituencies if we do it well, if we're trying to create support for an initiative. And the last bullet I have on here, enhancing efficiency, might not seem that intuitive. Most of us, when we think about public participation, efficiency isn't the very first thing that comes to mind, right? So I have a little evidence I want to share with you that supports this idea that public participation and collaboration can actually enhance the efficiency of your projects. So in one study on which I was a principal investigator, we were looking at forest planning processes. So these processes are mandated by the National Environmental Policy Act, and they require a certain series of steps through which interdisciplinary teams, these are teams of all sorts of ologists within the Forest Service, work together to assess the likely environmental impacts of action. So they work together in groups and they run public involvement, and hopefully after a couple years they're through the process and they're able to do things on the landscape that ideally are good. So we did this survey of almost 500 team leaders on these processes, and also the decision maker that sits above them, who makes the decision after all the analyses are done. And one of the questions we asked the team leaders was about their team working style. And we've been told in these qualitative interviews we had done that, if you want to be really efficient, what you do is you just bring the team members together and you divvy up tasks, and everyone goes off and works on their tasks. And you come together to update each other and receive task assignments and kind of put it all together in the end. We asked about these in sort of this interesting way. There's 6 or 7 specific these processes. Within each stage, we asked them to identify the work style of the team. One, what I described, that team members are working separately or in small, mostly single-discipline groups. Another, that they're kind of coming together just to report out. And the third style being they're collaborating together across areas of expertise and deliberating at a regular sort of pace together in the same room, arguing about things. And we measured a number of outcomes of these projects. One of the ones we measured was relative efficiency. Which projects were more efficient than others, according to the people who participated? And really striking, there was a very strong statistical correlation between the teams that were engaged arguing with each other and those working together, actively deliberating most aspects of the project as a group, had more efficient processes than these teams that were divvying up the work. So it was sort of a nice finding that we could share with the Forest Service that, hey, this is actually a good thing when we do this. I'll give some of the other drivers of outcomes in that study because they're really relevant to public participation as well. So the point of that whole story I just told is that collaboration can actually be pretty efficient, even though it doesn't feel that way up front. It can remove a lot of barriers later in the game that come back and bite you. And it can also allow for you to consider a whole bunch of ideas that might not have made it into the argument earlier. That makes the entire project a better one. So when we think about reasons for public involvement, you shared a few with me. We could think about a few things. Some people think about public involvement, and I would say this is probably one of the ways we think about it in the environmental education field, is that we're providing a service, right? We're doing environmental education, and this is really good. We're teaching people things, and it's wonderful, and we need to continue to do that. What I'm primarily going to be focusing on here, and from the examples you shared with me, it looks like all might be interested in multi-directional public involvement. That means that we're not just providing a service, but we're actually looking for input, collaboration, and working together on project, on solving some sort of problem. Throwing up some gobbledygook academic terms here, just to head around some of the reasons why agencies, organizations, and other folks do public involvement. So explain these terms. The first one we call substantive public involvement. This is the one that's actually mandated by the National Environmental Policy Act. It's whenever you're doing something, you're required to get in the public because they might have knowledge that you don't have, right? There's substance to the input that they give, and that should help us make better decisions. Substantive public involvement is. No public involvement is something different. It means that part we're trying to understand from the public values, what the public really wants, which is a bit different from what the public knows, right? We get factual knowledge and incorporate that into our own decision-making, or we can debate what the right outcomes are. So these are pretty different types of public involvement. The third type listed here is instrumental public involvement, and the way we measured that in studies is the idea that the purpose behind public involvement is to get buy-in from other groups. So we could think about this as persuasive communication or constituency building, or getting everyone on the same page to build a collaborative initiative. Last one here, which is a bit less jargony term, it's not out there in the literature, but we've called it procedural public involvement. It's the idea that some do public involvement just because they have to. It's a requirement that comes along with their job. So some of you who work in federal agencies, it is a requirement sometimes. And what we refer to as procedural public involvement, we're seeing it in a way that is just the requirement. We do it because we have to, and there's really not much that comes of it. Same study of 500 planning processes on federal lands found that team leaders who believed in either substantive public involvement, those that like something we can actually learn from the public, and it's actually our obligation to consider public values on this particular project. Those not only resulted in better public relations from a project, but it also enhanced the efficiency of projects and had positive impacts on the environment resulting from the project. So these, a lot of times, the ones we were looking at get held up in appeals or litigation. When we had a team leader who believed that public involvement was more than just convince people that they were right or a requirement, things actually turned out better for the project. So there's a lot of argument to say it's not necessarily the techniques that are used, but it's the intent behind them that can drive some of this. Any questions yet? I'll in that chat room. Thanks for typing things up in there. Okay. So, as Judy mentioned, I've been doing research all over the place on environmental conflicts, public participation of all forms. This is a list of a lot of projects that I've done work on. These plans, as I mentioned, have done a lot of work on conflicts between national parks and the people that live around them. Projects in the U.S., in Indonesia, in the Caribbean, in South America, in Nepal. We've done a study of nature centers in the United States, looking at how local people value those centers. And we've done work on what drives deforestation in Africa and Uganda specifically. And we've also done a lot of work on just environmental outreach, education, communications, and interpretation. And in all those studies, one factor really seems to drive a lot of people's behavior. Factor, surprise, is trust. So as we think about trust, comes about, I'd love to just get you to try to do, if you can get your fingers ready, to type in the chat box, what is trust? Does anybody want to try and throw in like a short phrase that defines it? I'll definition in a minute. But a lot of people have different ideas about what trust is, and it can be pretty interesting to see how we all look at it. So go ahead, I'm going to pause for 30 seconds and have folks type into the chat room their definition of trust. Who's brave?
Okay, has to type in. Come on.
There we go. Believing in someone's actions, words, and intentions. Cool. Action relies on another or on an agency. Like a behavioral definition. That's cool. Feel honest. Faith. You're good. Okay, cool. So we're all on similar pages here. Keep them. Mutual best interest. I'm going to I'll tell you that in the literature there's kind of two ways people look at trust. One is behavioral, and it means with trust you, I actually take an action and it's in sense of behavior. However, most of us who study this look at the psychological state. And that psychological state is basically, in simplified terms, what I've got on this slide here. It's the willingness to accept vulnerability in the face of certainty. Could you think about that for a moment? We accept vulnerability. There's elements of risk in here. I'd like to ask you, you don't have to type anything in this time, but I would like to pause and have you just think about and what, maybe in different situations. All right, in a personal situation, why would I trust somebody maybe to look after my kids while I'm out? What characteristics I'm looking for? How do I make that assessment? In a situation, what made me trust a coworker or a organization to a particular task? Public situation, what trust a politician to do anything? Or you should it down a little bit, maybe a district ranger or a park superintendent or the head of an organization. What makes you trust them? Oh, record and oh, good, you are typing some stuff. Feel free to type some stuff in there, yeah. If you want to share, that's cool. Past actions, I like that. Hopefully this is rolling around in your head a little bit, and maybe it's got you a little bit intrigued. I'm going to talk to you about what we've developed that spans a whole bunch of disciplines. There's a lot of disciplines there that have looked at the concept of trust, a lot of management literature, some from psychology, organizational psychology, sociology. We've sort of put those together to come up with a consistent framework that helps us understand how it works in these collaborative natural resource management environmental situations. So I'm going to share with you 4 forms of trust. Each of them are in terms of how they come about. The first is pretty much inherent in your personal makeup and history. The second 2 are interpersonal, and the last one is mostly based on context. And here are these, all 3 of them are really actionable. When we're going out and doing public participation, we could really think about how to use them. So, let's go ahead and look. So the very first one, dispositional trust. Now your answer to that question I just laid out there might help you understand your own dispositions, right? Whether you're generally a trusting person or not. So there's a heck of a lot we can do about somebody's predisposition to be trusting or distrusting. We probably all know people, and we could probably evaluate ourselves, right? I'm only a trusting person, I give people the benefit of the doubt, or no, you got to prove it to me. Guilty, proven innocent. How this is useful to us is we know that, especially for those of you who work for natural resource management agencies or environmental projects, oftentimes people showing up to big public fora for those situations start from a baseline of dispositional distrust or a lack of trust. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't show up, right? Completely trust you to just the right decisions and do what's best for everybody, why come? Now, if let's say your public participation is about generating volunteers, volunteer work day, let's say. Well, the people who show up, you probably got the benefit of the doubt. So what dispositional trust helps us understand is we starting from what's the likely baseline in my audience. Knowing that baseline, or at least having some idea, we can start to build these more actionable forms of trust. The first actionable form of trust we call rapid trust. What this is based on a specific prediction of an outcome. Okay, so if you predict how you're going to act, the outcome of that action is good for me, I'm likely to trust you. Okay. Now, if I can predict how you're going to act and it's going to be bad for me, I'm likely to distrust you. So this has to do with information. Can make a prediction. Sometimes, because of that, it's based on consistent performance, past performance, track records, promises, and being good at what we do. Can we demonstrate our competence? So oftentimes when we talk about trust in public, or if I ask you, hey, why do you trust somebody? Most of you probably jumped right to this. Track record. How good is that person at doing something? As much as we would like to be, most of us aren't entirely rational when we're making our decisions. So this type of actionable trust I want to share, we call it affinitive trust. We call it that because it's based on affinity, the person or group or organization you might be putting trust in. This has to do with emotional connections, assumptions of similar values, experiences. Sometimes it can be almost heuristic. I have response to charisma up there. We just met people that we naturally gravitate toward, and until they've got our trust. It's pretty hard to predict, but if working in public participation, we can think about some ways that we might be able to generate this type of trust. Active caring, listening, responsiveness. I had one public meeting, more than one public meeting, going through the standard NEPA process, the process associated with the National Environmental Policy Act, where scoping is happening. And scoping is supposed to allow the public a chance to help define the problem and define what analyses need to be done to assess impacts. And a park superintendent stand in front of the room and be asked the question, well, Clay, you think there's a problem. Why don't you share with us, the audience, what you think it is? And the superintendent saying, well, that's not really the purpose of this here. We're here to get your comments, not answer questions. You can imagine what that does to affinitive trust here, right? Just hiding behind the procedure. So this comes from social interaction, and it also comes from exposing shared values. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. But really get underneath the position or the argument they're making and understanding why they're making it is helpful here. So I love this quote from Stephen R. Covey. This is the guy who wrote the 7 habits of highly effective people. Like the exact title of the book. It has to do with just being a genuine, authentic good person, listening and being responsive. Tips are often a really useful thing for this, to generate that common ground between folks and start to understand where there is common ground. Those are both interpersonal for trust. The third is based on the system in which we're interacting. Okay? So some of you have placed, I'm looking in the chat room, which is why I'm pausing. Comments here about, I want to get people together so we can do collective action. We're trying to get together for a particular process where there's going to be decisions made, there's going to be tasks that we have to agree upon. The procedures by which we do that are really going to matter to us. Okay, just trust in the procedures that we create. And if we can trust those procedures or the system, we don't have to trust each other quite as much, as long as we all agree that we're going to follow these rules. Right? Think about lots of systems that protect us in some way. Remember, if we're defining trust as vulnerability, the willingness to accept it, we need some protection because there's risk. So I'm going to say there's 2 types of control systems, is what these are actually called in the literature. And some of them can be really good at developing other forms of trust, and some of them can hit other forms of trust. So all these forms of trust interact. So in trust limiting systems, these are systems that are really coercive, where there's binding contracts and forced regulations. This is how we do it. If you go to a standard public hearing, I've been to many, and for those of you who have been, you'll understand, you get up and you have your 3 minutes to make your statement. Right? So what do you do in those 3 minutes? Dream as you can possibly be to make an impassioned argument, and there's no interchange. This is a system that doesn't really help us build any other form of trust. Binding contracts, they do protect us to some degree, but they don't really help us generate rational or affinitive trust. Now, systems that help us in positively with these other forms of trust. And we can all sit down and agree upon procedures that we're going to operate by. We come up with shared criteria for how we're going to make decisions. We can come up with a process for making decisions that's transparent so everyone knows exactly what's going to happen. Then if I'm giving public comment at one of those public hearings, it's very clear, okay, so we're going to record your comment. You see all the comments right here, and we will give a response to each one within this time period so you know that we've considered them. That is quite a long way in these situations. We can also think of, can we empower people in different ways to be active participants in the process? Extend beyond these sort of big public involvement type things to just environmental education or persuasive communication or environmental interpretation programs. We all know that participants in those programs, it's really cool when you have a say in what actually happens. Well, that's actually creating a system that allows us to start to build those other forms of trust, that affinitive trust in particular. So the key points I'd really like to make is when we think about these forms of trust, and particularly these three that are we can do something about. Like I said, it's very difficult to influence somebody's predispositions, but we can influence rational, affinitive, and systems-based trust. I'd like you to think about these as if they're an ecosystem. And we have this term, we call this trust ecology, because we're thinking about how diversity really enhances ecosystem function and resilience. So if we want resilient collaboration, resilient public participation, we put stores of all forms of these types of trust. And think about it, think about resilience in response to disturbance and change. We know these things are ever changing. We need to work together. So what happens all the time when we're working with other folks on a long-term project? There's turnover. So maybe had an amazing, charismatic leader who had everybody's affinity trust, everybody loved them. What happens when they leave? Well, any procedures in place to deal with the turnover or deal with a new leader, somebody coming in, it's very difficult to weather that storm. We get out a rational failure. Some fails to perform in the ways that's expected. Well, we know from experience that if we have a good affinitive relationship with that person, we can still work together and we can try to get them to help us. And if we have a system that protects us in that case, there's some sort of backup. Okay. Procedures may change. If good interpersonal relationships, with that as well, policy changes. Have what we call an affinitive failure. This is the toughest to recover from. So this is when somebody has an argument, or maybe there's a breach of integrity, where somebody claims to be one thing, but clearly they're acting in another way. But if they're good performers still, we have a system to protect us, we can see how each type of trust can buffer each other type of trust. So when we're thinking about public participation, collaboration, negotiation, all these sorts of things, apply this in lots and lots of different settings, and it's ringing empirically in the studies we're doing that systems and collaborations that are resilient have adequate stores of all three of these forms of trust. Through having a facilitator that maintains the procedures in a fair, transparent way for everybody. We think about first starting out in a collaboration, can we demonstrate through small tasks? We can build rational trust for each other, and can actually make time to really listen to each other and get to know each other to build affinitive trust. So lots of applications of this, and there's lots of other theories and approaches to which you could sort of overlay this framework and it'll make sense. And I'm just going to do that with one that you may not be familiar with, but it's really applicable for, I think, a lot of the contexts that I'll work in. I haven't heard of this book, and I'm sorry the ends don't work. You can't really see the book, but this is Getting to Yes. All right, this is a group, it's the Harvard Negotiation Project. They talk about how to negotiate effectively. And a lot of this work, it's come from all over the world. It began Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These folks trying to figure out, how do you actually negotiate? We have these 4 principles for how to do this well. The first is obvious, a win-win solution. Can we come up with a decision that works for everybody? That doesn't really get a whole lot to how, but it's just the idea that try to from winners and losers in these situations. The next 3 bullets are really cool. So first here is interests versus positions. And what Fisher and their colleagues say is a position is the argument we're making, right? So you might take an argument about water quality standards, and there's one side that says we need to lighten the standards for arsenic in the water because factories and industry just can't deal with that. We lessen water quality standards. And then you'll have environmental groups say, absolutely not. No, these are there for a reason. The Clean Water Act is there for a reason. Don't lower it. You can think of other arguments like lower taxes or keep taxes the same, right? Those are positions. That's what we want to happen. Interest is what underlies those positions, right? If we take the water quality example, why do people want to lower water quality standards? Well, they're interested in the economic prosperity of industry. Why do people want to keep them the same? Well, they're either interested in biodiversity, habitat, or public health. Move from positions to interests, it gets a lot easier to talk to each other, right? Because people who care about public health probably all understand the desire for economic prosperity. And people who care about economic prosperity probably also care about public health. We have some common ground that we can start to work with. We can also, by recognizing that we have interests that overlap or values that overlap, this can start to build affinitive trust. We can start to like each other and see each other as people rather than as just the other side or the enemy. Let's attack the problem, not the people. And another way to think about this is, well, the way of doing it is to focus on interests and not positions. But just instead of going face head-to-head on something, just turning shoulder to shoulder and looking at the problem together. We really do that when we start to understand that we share some common interests and some common values. The fourth thing they say is critically important as well, and that's establishing mutually agreed upon criteria for evaluating potential outcomes. If we can agree upon some common interests, then we actually say, okay, here are the characteristics of an acceptable solution or acceptable goal that we can collaborate and work together toward, what it would look like. We have that, we can work toward all these other things. The reason I've pointed systems-based to those last 2 is oftentimes creating procedures through which we interact with each other in public participation can really help us there, right? We can create ground rules for how we talk to each other, ground rules for how decisions get made. In some of the case studies we've looked at, we're looking at the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program in the U.S. as an example. What this is these large landscapes at minimum of 50,000 acres. Most of them are hundreds of thousands of acres, and they have many land ownership types. So we have Forest Service involved, private landowners, tribes, state governments, all sorts of folks, and we together to figure out how to manage the landscape. Particularly, these are fire-prone landscapes, and there's concern about fire, and the main goal is to reduce restoration. Well, there's really neat things happening. So some of them are using facilitators in the way that I just mentioned. Sometimes when they get together, they can set up a charter whereby if you disagree with the consensus or the dominating recommendation of the collaborative group, you can still file a minority report in opposition. You can still be heard. And then those recommendations go on over to the landowners separately. Or will actually go together, but they're 2 separate recommendations. So there's ways that we can make sure that everybody feels heard, right? In a system that can protect you, you feel less vulnerable if you know that your voice is still going to remain even if you disagree.
And somebody asked the question, I think you just answered it, what can environmental educators do to help with system-based trust, and how do you know that trust is the issue? So you were talking about that.
Well, that's a really great question. Maybe we can come back around to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I'd love to share just 2 other key lessons before we just open it up for discussion. best way to show this is just to jump right in this other study that we did. So my, if the ends work, this would look totally cool. But I'll just have to describe it. So, lessons is that not all conflict is bad. And a little bit of distrust, a little bit of lack of trust can actually be a good thing, right? If you're 100% trusting, it can lead to apathy. There's productive and unproductive conflict. So what this yellow line shows, this one that goes from the top left to the bottom right, if y-axis, we have the quality of an outcome, collaborative group. And on the x-axis, in this case, we have the amount of disagreement about how to get the work done. Okay? So the literature tells us that the more we argue about how to do something, the worse it is, because we kind of get stuck. So that kind of conflict tends to be bad. So in a study of over 100 planning processes across the Forest Service, we found the same pattern. But it tells us, and the red line that says hypothesized, that if we're disagreeing about the appropriate outcome, if it's the red line, okay? So if there's no disagreement about the appropriate outcome, or what's happened, it tends to be a very good outcome because we don't really debate anything. We just kind of go and there's groupthink, nothing really happens. If there's a medium level of disagreement, because we debate, this is great, we come up with better ideas because we're forced to defend our ideas. When we get all the way to the right, it back down again, because if there's too much disagreement, well, we can again get stalemated. Study of about, I think we had 106, actually I'm sure we had 106 planning teams. We actually measured the quality outcomes of these planning teams. We found the green, exactly opposite from what predicted in the literature. So I was here in my office banging against the wall trying to figure out why this happened. It took a little while to figure out what was going on. So the question that we were asking to make this graph was a point scale. And on the left side, we were asking the leader of the team, to what extent did the team disagree about what the outcome should be. And on the left end, it was they didn't disagree at all. They totally agreed. On the end, there was a lot of disagreement. And in the middle was this neutral. Really, what I recognized is, boy, I didn't really measure this very well first off. But there was a lesson in here that was really cool. What was happening is if the team leader was either unsure how the team members felt about the appropriate outcome, or they just never had that conversation at all. They never deliberated what the appropriate outcome would be. If they allowed themselves to have that deliberation and conflict, the outcomes turned out better. So another one of these really critical things that if the team, once we backtracked and looked at all the factors that were involved here, basically there was enough trust amongst the team that they felt they could be vulnerable to each other and have those discussions. Right, so this is really cool. This is looking at these teams on these planning processes. Again, in our study, once we blew this up to over 500 processes, we found that the internal relationships of the team, particularly between the team leader and the officer above them, and then collaboration within the team, how much they deliberated, were predictive as their external relationships. You know, there was a lot of conflict with the public of outcomes. One of the key lessons here, and I'm going to share one more example of this, is that house in order internally is equally important, and in fact, in some of our studies, more important than how you interact with the public, because it drives how interaction with the public takes place sometimes. In a study that I did years ago, looking at relationships between protected areas and the people that live around them, it was an interesting finding I'd like to share. So you're looking at pictures on the left here, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and right, Virgin Islands National Park. There were other parks in this study too, one in southern Ecuador, and we've done similar work elsewhere. what we found was, is we did 265 interviews around these parks. And we asked people how they got their information. Cited they knew a locally hired person who worked on the maintenance staff, just a neighbor who happened to get hired for the park, significantly more negative attitudes toward the park, and more likely to be active opposing the park, either through illegal resource extraction, vandalism, all the things that the park doesn't want you to do. Well, those who knew a manager or somebody high up had the opposite relationship. They were more positive. Tracking that by doing interviews throughout these organizations and interviewing all these folks who work for the park. And what it turned out was these locally hired folks had no idea what was going on in the management. And they were sharing effort with the park managers and misinformation. At Vernones National Park, I asked systematically 115 people who lived on that island. There was a time when the relationship between this national park and the people felt better. For those who aren't familiar with that park, it's very conflicted. The park takes up 2/3 of the island, and then a lot of acrimony between the park and local residents for all sorts of reasons. But everybody I asked, yeah, there was. In the late 70s, things just seemed to be a heck of a lot better. And it was uncanny how consistently everyone who was alive at that time, every single person I interviewed who was alive at that time pointed to that time period. So I tracked that down. What was happening during that time period? Well, it turned out they had a superintendent of the park at that time named Bob Stanton. If you recognize that name, he later became the director of the National Park Service. He had a particular style of management. One, he would walk the streets all the time, just chat with people, host parties at his house. And whenever he had a major decision to make, he would go hang out with the locally hired maintenance crew. Not like check in with them for 10 minutes. He'd spend the afternoon just chatting about stuff and getting around. Hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you guys think? By all reports, that shifted the relationship between this park and the people that lived around it drastically. And sense of illegal poaching went down and relationships improved. When the post, everything else stayed the same. All the management procedures, all the rules, all the regulations were the same. But when he left his post, everything went back to this situation of acrimony, right? So it talks about, it kind of gives them sense that trust on its own isn't enough because there was no system or rational trust there to bolster it. Okay, so let's get down to kind of the end of this. Take-home points that I'd like to make, and then we can come up to discussion and questions. So the main point I'd love for you to take away, and again, these are broad principles, these reasonable forms of trust seem to really, really make a difference. Enhancing perceptions of performance are important for building rational trust. Can we be consistent? Can we always follow through? Little reaches in that go a long way. Affinitive, can we expose similarities between people? Can we talk about interests and not positions and build shared experiences? And serious trust is also critically important. Can we delineate a system whereby everybody feels like they're heard and demonstrate that they are in fact heard? And can we put upon processes and criteria for judging what actual good outcome might be? So the point, we really think about this. Trust is a really hard thing to fake. Okay, so this isn't something that we're like, oh, we just got to cover our bases. It's actually like something that you really have to buy into to do well. About these different pieces of trust all together and trying to keep our eye on all of those things are important. Power. In any situation that we're in, and give people some of the control over that situation, it loses their vulnerability, and it can create trust in the whole system we're creating. I mean, this really just comes down to being authentic and wanting to hear what people have to say. Doing public participation is really critical to any sort of outcome. Okay, I'm going to stop talking there, and we can just open it up to any sort of questions, discussion. If you debate anything I said or don't believe it, that's cool too. Let's go for that.
Thank you, Mark. And Finn, can you unmute the phones, and we're going to try this, or do you want to do it where you unmute your phone as you ask a question?
I can do it either way. If you want me to go ahead and unmute all the lines, I can do that, or an individual.
Let's just unmute the phones, and hopefully, if people are shuffling papers, you won't do that, and just you can put a mute so we can get some questions for Mark.
Sure.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Okay.
The lines should be unmuted.
The questions for Mark. Just same and jump right in there. Mark, somebody wants to see the last two slides again. Can you go backwards?
Yep. So let's start with this one here. And I'll forward to the next one in just a moment.
Is it okay if we send this out to everyone as a PDF and still have the recording?
Absolutely. I should say also, the very last slide, which I'll get to again, there's a web link there, and that will bring you to my Virginia Tech homepage. I'll go back to that slide in a moment. From there, we have some articles that are open access. So all I have to do is go to that page and click on Publications, that frec.vt.edu page, or you can just email me. And these are freely accessible articles. If you want to go a little more in depth and see examples of how this plays out in the field, they're available.
And Mark, turn then back over to me if people are asking questions.
Absolutely.
Any questions out there? Do you trust Mark to answer it correctly?
As well.
Yeah, guys, to folks, it looks like it was hard to send a message to everyone except for me and a few others. So Wes is always interesting.
My name is Katie Whiteman. I'm from Sequoia National Park. And you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. So a lot of our programs, our interpretational programs, are 30 to 50 minutes long, so it's not that much time. And how do we build trust in such a short amount of time? In relation to the public, when we're not necessarily as a team or behind the scenes, but when we have just such a short time with people?
What a great question. Well, first, I'll just say this. So you should email me because we did a whole study in the National Park Service where we looked at 400 live interpretive programs, a team of 4 graduate students observing them and tracking 56 characteristics of those programs, and then we did surveys with visitors. Look at what characteristics actually drove better outcomes for visitors. And the key things that came up were characteristics of the interpreters themselves, and were perceptions of whether the person was getting authentic emotion. So you can tell the difference between a scripted program where somebody's kind of going through the motions or trying to memorize and regarding memorize script, versus having a conversation with you, demonstrating care for the audience. The other piece that was really clear in that was responsiveness. That if you're talking to a large group, there's ways to demonstrate responsiveness, right? Some of the stuff that happens before a program, some of the concerns that you might bring about, storytelling that brings in a personal component, things of that nature. I mean, in that short of a period of time, rational trust by showing that you know your stuff, right, which I'm guessing most of your interpreters do. But affinitive trust thing is really important too, and you demonstrate that by trying to bring the content directly into the lives of the visitors, right? So it comes down to, I'm sure you're familiar with Tilden's principles. Those are dead on for generating trust in those stations. But I'd love to that study with you. It was a really fun study to do, and there's lots of findings.
My time for one more question.
Abby.
Okay, go for it.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Mark. Thanks for a great webinar. This is Abby out in Washington State, and have done capacity building work at various scales and over time. And one of the things I was wondering about was this applies at different scales. So, for example, you see people in, such a mistrust of politicians today in this country. And you gave of the guy, park director, who went and just hung out with the road crews and the person, does that same local touch apply to somebody working at the international or at the national levels?
Well, I hate to say it, but yes, because it's not easy,
Yay.
Right? I've done a lot of work on sort of international conservation and development projects, in Nepal and in South America, and what we see is the typical granting cycle, the 18-month grant where you go in, you do a big town meeting, people tell you what they want, and then you try and get started, and then the funding runs out and it stops and starts, is really damaging, more damaging than we can possibly imagine, because people perceive that promises have been broken. In places where we're embedding conservation workers, we're employing locals who are dedicated and giving them enough resources to actually do their work, they can build not only, the regional trust where they're actually getting something done, but they can build that affinitive trust and a system that's transparent, because if they're there and not coming in and out, going back to the capital city and out to the village,
right.
People get a system, it's transparent, and they can have some say in how it works as well. So, yeah, and there's some really interesting work out there being done on it's not being done, but there's some books out there where you can take this theory and kind of apply it internationally. I really like The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer if you do international work. And it talks collectivist versus individualist cultures. And you could start to see that the trust ecology framework really works, but there's different elements that might elevate. They're more powerful in certain cultures than others. Right? So one culture, you might say, or even individuals, like some people might rely on rational trust primarily, where other people, they're gut people or heart people, right? They're not head people. They rely on the feelings they have, the affinitive trust. For others, maybe they've been so burned by the government in the past that it's all about the system to protect them. So in with these in mind, you might even be able to make predictions about where it's going to matter most and what to really highlight.
Mark and Abby, thank you. We could talk to Mark for a long time, but we're running out of time. And Mark, we'll figure out how to keep this going. Really appreciate your time and the thinking you've done and the number of studies you have done. I can't wait for that book to come, by the way, on social theory. You're able to find this webinar. We are recording it on eePRO, and if you haven't been to NAAE.org, go there, go to eePRO, and you'll be able to find it, and we'll be able to keep the conversation going. And you can also always check out what future webinars are as we go forward. You can join a special interest group. You can log in, and we can talk more about this in the future. If anybody has any questions, this webinar is David Orr on March 23rd on systems thinking, which is really great. So really do want to hear from you on ideas. Mark, we're going to have to get you back again. We have put your email here, and I hope you don't mind some additional follow-up questions, because I think this is really important stuff for all of us who are working to build trust in this field. And if you have any questions, you can email me or Kristen. And Kristen, thank you so much for your help in putting all this together. And thanks to all of you for joining the webinar, and give us feedback about how we can continue to get the right stuff out to the field and really build the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for your great questions and thoughts, everyone. It was fun. And contact me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.